Well, it's great to talk with Bob Marks, and we've been friends and colleagues for a long time. But I've never gotten to talk about this subject and have an expert in the field give a preliminary discussion. So I usually have to try to presuppose some things about what people have in their minds about artificial intelligence. And he's done such a terrific job of giving the technical details in, I think, a very accessible way. By the way, a lot of those funny cartoons that you saw, those are his. Those are originals that he did. They're really funny. Those weren't generated by AI. Those were natural intelligences, actually. I want to talk about this subject, though, in a sort of cultural and political and philosophical way, because the way in which this issue impacts public policy is its effects on the job market. I'm going to summarize about 25 books for you that have been written in the last 3 or 4 years about the future of work and the rise of the robots. So this is a summary of them. So there's the dystopian take. The dystopian take on our near future is that intelligent robots are just around the corner. They will quickly take over most or all of the jobs that we're doing now, leaving at least half of the population permanently technologically unemployed. It's going to be a disaster because people won't have anything to do. The best thing we can do is have the government give everybody a basic income not to work. All right, so that's the dystopian take. Here's the utopian take. In the next few years, robots and smart machines are going to take over most or all of the jobs that we are now doing, leaving us with very little to do. The best that can happen is that we need the government to pay everybody not to do anything. And it's going to be awesome, because we're not going to have to do anything, right? We're going to just do what we want. And so we can just fish in the morning, and I don't know, probably we're in Austin, smoke pot in the afternoon, and it won't matter, right? Because you don't have to have a job. It's all going to be great. Now, I'm not making that up. That's the dystopian and the utopian take. Now, do you notice any similarities in these two kind of approaches? It's the same basic assumption. Right? What's the basic assumption? The basic assumption is that we are making machines that are at some point going to literally replace us. And the only kind of gloss is whether that's going to be a good or a bad thing. If you think of human work as mainly drudgery or toil, you might think that's a good thing. You hate your job. You know, you have one of these jobs like the characters in Office, you know, in Scranton, Pennsylvania, paper company. That would be nice not to have to do that all day. And so you think that'd be great. You're going to have all your needs met. The bottom parts of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is going to be provided by the robots, and you can concentrate, I don't know, on self-actualization or something like that. If, on the other hand, you actually look at the data, or you have a Christian anthropology and know that, in fact, one of the ways in which we achieve happiness and meaning in life is by work, is by creating value for others and for ourselves. And if we don't do that, we get really, really depressed. Then you actually realize that either of those stories is dystopian. Whichever one of those things happened, if either of those things happened, they would be dystopian rather than utopian. Now, I don't buy it, but I do think, and I write sort of on two tracks, sort of theology and economics and theology and science. And it was really my interest in economics and technology that got me interested in this issue. I did do an edited collection with Ray Kurzweil and George Gilder on artificial intelligence way back before Ray Kurzweil was a really famous guy. He's now a VP at Google. But he's the guy, he's sort of the leading transhumanist that proposes that we're going to build a mind. We're going to, once we have a high resolution enough scanner, we can scan our brains and we'll be able to upload ourselves to the internet, leave behind this fragile and frail mortal coil, and make ourselves immortal. You might have thought that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. He's a vice president at Google. And trust me, the founders of Google believe this is what they're doing. They believe they're going to create the first general artificial intelligence. And so when we talk about artificial intelligence, just make a distinction between two things. Artificial intelligence simply, or merely, or weak artificial intelligence, which is just some kind of technology that imitates certain aspects of intelligence. We encounter this every day. Every time you Google something, right, you encounter an aspect of intelligence that's very, very good. It's incredible. In fact, I think if you showed Google to someone in the 1950s, it would pass the Turing test for them. It'd just be eerie. But we all know perfectly well there are not 1,000, computer operators answering questions for us, right? And that's the kind of AI that's going to continue to improve and to do amazing and impressive things. There's going to be amazing, impressive robotics. That's going to happen. Distinguish that from the strong AI conceit which is just this idea that machines will eventually be like us, full stop, without remainder. They will become conscious, sentient, creative, purposeful agents. That's first of all where the interest is, and that's where the fear is. But there's a reason, of course, that whenever there's a movie about this, it's always about strong AI. Nobody wants to see a movie about a robot that doesn't become conscious, right? Okay, think of a 2.5-hour movie, not about Data on Star Trek, but the ship's computer. Only character, right? Just answers questions. This would be terrible. And so there's narrative reasons why you want to explore this question. But there's no metaphysical or philosophical or technological reason to believe that anything we are doing with robotics or machines or computers is going to become us or become like us in these truly significant and human ways. All right, I'm just sort of asserting that. And so what I want to explore tonight is this question. And the reason is because lots and lots and lots of smart people are using this rise of the robots as a justification for what I think of as very damaging political policies. If you think this story is true, you're going to be really worried. I mean, imagine if 5 years from now, half the American population is out of work, right? That is a type of disruption that we've never experienced. It'd be, catastrophic. And so if you thought that was true, you'd be willing maybe to test some pretty wacky policies. Now, at the moment, no one is proposing a universal basic income but for one guy named Andrew Yang. Has anybody heard of Andrew Yang yet? Okay, a few of you have. He's an entrepreneur. He's been campaigning in Iowa, which is a smart place to be campaigning right now. I'm guessing he may be at South by Southwest sometime this week. And he's proposing a universal basic income. And it's actually kind of well thought out. I read about it today. Let me make a prediction that this will become a kind of consensus policy position for at least one part of the political spectrum, and maybe both or all parts of the political spectrum. So it's coming, whether you like it or not, and it's being justified by this idea of the rise of the robots and the idea that robots will take all the jobs. Now, anybody that's studied economic history knows that somebody could have made this argument at any point in history. The first time somebody figured out how to, dig a hole or create a furrow in the ground or chip two flint rocks together and to start a controlled fire, they made a previous way of working obsolete, right? So every technological innovation, in a sense, makes a way we were doing something obsolete. But is that a disaster? If it were always a disaster, if that led to permanent unemployment, human history would be this depressing story of increasing unemployment, right? I mean, you could say in 1776, 95% of the population was living and working on farms. 95% of the population, right? Somebody, look at a steam engine and think, gosh, we're going to get really productive. At some point, maybe only 5% of the population will be needed to work on farms. 90% of the population will then be out of work. I mean, what else are people going to do? If you were a farmer in 1776, you couldn't be a web designer or social media manager. There were not a lot of options. And so the logic would seem to work. But of course, it's wrong. Here we are in 2019. The population is 10 times what it was then. Coming up on 1% of the population lives and works on farms. And depending on how you count it, we're 10 to 100 times wealthier and better off than our ancestors were. So what happened? Well, what happens economically is that we develop more efficient ways of doing things we need to have done, that brings the price of those things down so we don't spend a lot of money on food now like people used to, and that frees up our labor and our ingenuity to do other things. And we do those. And we do things that nobody had ever thought needed to be done before. So most of us have jobs that didn't exist maybe even 100 years ago. How many of you are actual farmers? I don't mean you own a farm. I mean you get your income from farms. Now I know I'm in the middle of Austin, so maybe there's one or a couple. Okay, that's statistically about right, actually. And I suspect we'll quickly get to 1% of the population. So why is this different? Why are robots and AI any different? Well, the argument is that what we were doing before is we were just kind of enhancing our labor. Whereas with high technology, with information technology, we're literally replacing ourselves. There's a very interesting book by a guy named Martin Ford, who wrote a book called The Rise of the Robots, and I argue with Ford a lot in The Human Advantage, primarily because he's a perfect distillation of this argument. But here's how he puts it in his book. Here's the basic gist of his argument. He says, the shift now underway will ultimately challenge one of our most basic assumptions about technology, that machines are tools that increase the productivity of workers. Instead, machines themselves are turning into workers, so they will literally replace us. All right, so you see how that goes? It's not like a shovel that you still need a person to use the shovel. A robot that knows what it needs to shovel will do all that for us. And so it eventually replaces us, and you can imagine robot building robots and robot factories that are made by other robot factories and things like that. Somehow we're not involved. All right, well, there's a bunch of stuff to be said about this. So here's the summary. The conclusion of my argument is don't buy it. It's just not true. It's not going to follow. Now, I'm not saying, oh, all this stuff's hogwash. We're not going to get autonomous self-driving cars. We're not going to get robots that can do things that we're doing. In fact, I think a lot of that stuff's right around the corner. So there is a real challenge to the information economy, but it's not the rise of the Terminator or Skynet. It's basically this. It's not the end of work, but the accelerating pace of change and disruption. And so that's a different thing. Think about it the way in which, just in my lifetime, just the changes in the way in which we transmit and store music and sound take place. So when I was a little kid, I played my mom's LP records as a little kid. I played the Sound of Music soundtrack. It's kind of embarrassing to admit in public. That's what I did, LPs. And then, my dad made a massive investment in a transition technology called 8-track tapes, which were terrible. And they were quickly replaced by cassette tapes, which were quickly replaced by CDs. And I haven't bought a CD in 9 years, right? What do we do now? We transmit music in purely digital form. We've moved almost entirely from the realm of atoms to the world of bits, at least with respect to this thing, right? Of course, there's physical infrastructure in place. That's just happened in one way. That shows you how radical and fast is the change. And there's evidence and reason to think that the pace of change will actually get even faster. That's something we're going to have to deal with. Christians are going to have to figure out, how do we constantly present the truth, the fundamental truths of the gospel, which do not change, in a culture that continuously changes and changes more quickly than cultures can actually handle it. That's a real problem, but it's a different kind of problem. So what do we do? Do we need to worry about our jobs? And this is the question I get asked all the time. And of course, I'm a philosopher, so I say, well, it depends. What's your job? You know, and you might think, if I'm doing manual labor, that's dangerous. I'm in trouble. But if I'm doing something that requires mental, work, I'm fine. Think of the amazing stuff we've done with computers: chess, Go, ordinary language translation. You know what we don't have a machine that can do? Gardening. There's no Rosie the robot housekeeper, right? Can't do that. Hairdressers. You want your hair cut by a robot? No. It turns out that there's a thing called Moravec's paradox that makes it harder to build a machine that can do these kinds of things. Amazon has amazing fulfillment centers that are almost entirely automated, but for one step, right at the end of the chain, you have a self-driving forklift that finds the pallet, finds the product, moves it to where it needs to be, and then you have one carbon unit with hands that picks the thing up and puts it in a box on the conveyor belt. Because we can't make machines yet that know how to distinguish really well between glass and toilet paper and popcorn and all these different kinds of things. But a 3-year-old can do that. Right? And so it's not as simple as manual labor disappears, mental work is favored. It's much more complicated. It has to do with the kinds of things that can be automated and repeated. So if you're in kind of what's called blue-collar work, if you're in a factory that is an assembly line in which you're doing a single discrete job, get a plan B. That was a 20th century way of doing things, and it is going to disappear. If you want to do something with your hands, develop a skilled trade that involves complex bodily movements, and robots aren't going to replace you anytime soon. There's a bunch of stuff, though, that you might be doing, on the other hand, in white-collar work that will be replaced. Certain kinds of financial analysis is already disappearing, and actuarial work and accounting work. So it's actually really complicated to kind of get a hold of this. And so I think rather than saying, okay, focus on these types of jobs, learn to code. Did you know you can get taken off of Twitter right now if you tell a journalist to learn to code if he's lost his job? I'm not making that up, right? But, don't tell people that, apparently. What we want to do is we want to understand, what's this economy like? And then that will allow us to focus on what I would argue is uniquely human. In other words, what you always want to do when you're thinking about an economic situation is you say, okay, what is the situation and what are my competitors? What are the needs that need to be met? What's the product, the good or service that needs to be made? And then what can I do that is in my comparative advantage? That is that I can either do better than everybody else or at least do least badly. And so what we want to do is we want to try to anticipate what's going to happen, and then what should we do to focus on those things that only we can do and that machines will never be able to do. And to understand that, you really need to understand the main features of the information economy. So let me give you a 15-minute survey of what makes the information economy distinct from, say, the industrial economy or the agrarian economy. Not unique, but distinct. The first I've actually already mentioned is that it's highly disruptive. All right, and that's basically a cost. And you can guess what that means. The other things, and I'll define these, so all these terms, is that growth in the information sector is exponential, it's digital, it's hyperconnected, and it's ever more informational. And if you get this, you'll realize, okay, that's what's kind of going on here. Now, what's exponential? Well, exponential just, in this case, refers to a particular type of growth. We're used to linear growth, where, if you're a realtor, for instance, and maybe you sold 6 houses last year, and then maybe this year you sell 8 houses or 9 houses. You're just adding, right, numerically to the total. That's something that we can comprehend. Exponential growth, though, is where you have an exponent. Let's say the exponent is 2, right? And so rather than doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256. Off you go. If you do that, by the way, about 30 times, you end up way out in the millions. That's exponential growth. And that's something that's actually hard to grasp intellectually. Most of you have probably heard of Moore's Law, which is a nice illustration of this. Gordon Moore was an engineer at a company called Fairchild Semiconductor. He later went on to co-found the Intel Corporation. In 1965, he wrote a famous engineering paper in which he noticed that engineers were able to pack about twice the number of transistors on an integrated circuit that they were able to about 18 to 24 months earlier. So in other words, roughly every 2 years, they could double the number of transistors that they could pack on what we call a computer chip. Right? Now that's exponential growth, right? So it's doubling every 2 years. And he realized how significant this was. He said, this will probably go on maybe for 10 years or something like that. Well, it's still going. It's still going all these years later. And somebody named it Moore's Law, like it's a law of the universe that's inevitable. It's not inevitable. If we detonated all the nukes, trust me, Moore's Law would not hold next year, probably, right? Nevertheless, it's a really interesting trend. And Ray Kurzweil actually wondered, because people said, well, maybe this is just the properties of crystalline silica. That is, it's something to do with the physical properties of the material that we use to make computer chips. And so he knew that just in the 20th century, we had used 5 different kinds of physical media to do computation. And so he reframed this as the amount of computation, the amount of computations you could do per second for $1,000 at a particular time. And I don't know how well you guys can see this, but it starts out around 1900 as electromechanical, and then it changes early World War II to relay, and then to vacuum tube, which is what we think of at the end of World War II, and then transistors, and then integrated circuits. 5 fundamentally different physical ways of doing things. And if you'll notice those dots going along there, and you'll notice you've got a logarithmic scale on the vertical axis. That exponential trend has continued for over a century across 5 different physical media, suggesting that it's this trend that transcends the physical stuff. It's a very, very strange thing. And it turns out Moore's Law is actually really slow compared to things like storage and all these sorts of things. George Gilder's new book, Life After Google, he describes the way in which other trends and other information technologies actually makes Moore's Law look sort of lazy and slow. That's exponential growth. And it's one of the reasons to expect drastic disruption in the age ahead. The second is that it's digital. Now, most people use that word digital. I actually as a kid, I thought digital meant a watch that had numbers on it rather than analog, because my dad got a digital watch. It wasn't until later that I realized it actually refers to the zeros and ones of computer language, a sort of binary language. In a great book called The Second Machine Age, these guys, Eric Ben Halson and Andrew McAfee, put it this way. They say, digitization is the work of turning all kinds of information and media, text, sounds, photos, video, data, from instruments and sensors into the zeros and ones that are the native language of computers and their kin. Now, why does this matter? Well, it matters because digital goods and services have a weird property that confounds economists. The first is that they approach zero marginal cost, and the second is that they're non-rival goods. Now, what does that mean? Okay, let me give you an example. Think about it in a physical set of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Right, it has a physical weight. You can still buy these. They're a few $1,000s. Used to be a status symbol. You could make, say, 100,000 copies of it in your print run, do them in Singapore or something like that, and then you'd reduce the cost of each copy. Right? Nevertheless, you're never going to get to a stage in which a set of the Encyclopedia Britannica is going to cost you 0 cents to produce, because it takes paper and wood and glue and cardboard, and you have to store it and you have to ship it and things like that. That's called a rival good. So if I have a full set of Encyclopedia Britannica in my study and my bookshelf in my house, you can't also have it. Most physical things are like this. If I eat a banana, you can't also have it. Does that make sense? So it's a rival good. And it doesn't have 0 marginal cost. Marginal cost just means how much it costs to produce the next copy of a thing. Now think about a different but similar product, a subscription to the Encyclopedia Britannica online. $69 a year, way better, because it's constantly updated with video and it's integrated, of course, across the internet. If I get a subscription to the Encyclopedia Britannica, does that prevent you from doing it? Is there one less subscription? If I download a song for $1.29 on iTunes, is there one less for everybody else? No. Digital goods are non-rival. It's like there's a potentially infinite set of the supply. Moreover, once the infrastructure is in place, it costs Apple virtually nothing for me to download that single $1.29 file. So we go from economics as a study of the sort of exchange of scarce goods and resources to, in some ways, an exchange of weirdly abundant, nearly free goods and services. And economists are still trying to figure out how to account for this. Most of the economic growth now that we have isn't counted in GDP, in these regular figures, because nobody buys it. Every free app, that doesn't show up on economic statistics. That's transformational, and it's hugely significant. And more things that we assumed had to exist in the world of atoms are moving into the world of bits. That's what digitization is often described as. It's a transition from the world of atoms and molecules to the world of bits. Now, of course, we live in the world of atoms and molecules, right? So those are still relevant. But the meaning of this, actually, a lot of smart people are still trying to figure it out, but it's hugely significant. The third needs absolutely no explanation. Hyperconnected, right? We all know this because it's driving us crazy because we haven't figured out how to adapt. But just about 250 years ago, the fastest way a person could transfer information or communicate with somebody at a distance was as fast as a single horse with a rider, with the Pony Express, the fastest way. You had the telegraph, of course, and telephones. And now a significant chunk of the human population is connected in real time to each other at roughly the speed of light. Now that's important because of something called Metcalfe's law. Metcalfe's law was coined by a guy named George Gilder. And Metcalfe's law describes the value of a network. And the basic idea is that the value of a network increases exponentially as the number of nodes on the network, like the number of people. So think about it with respect to telephones. Somebody once said, the greatest salesman in the world is the guy that sold the first telephone. All right? Think about it. It's like, this is going to be awesome, right? No one to talk to. There's no value to it until someone else has a telephone. It's connected. You want to talk to them, right? And you're able to. Then it has a little value, but it's just one connection. Add a third person, and now you've got two different connections. A fourth person, you see how this goes. Very quickly, the value of the network balloons exponentially, right? And so as this kind of interconnectivity continues, as it will continue, both with respect to the kind of details of it and the resolution of it and the speed of it, that's going to have huge, huge implications for us. Kevin Kelly, who's an editor at Wired Magazine, has an interesting book a couple of years ago called The Inevitable. He's kind of on the other side of this debate, as you guess from the title. But he said 1,000 years ago, from now, if we're still here, people and historians will look back on the time in which we live right now at the beginning of the 21st century as a magical time, because it was at that moment that we, all of us, the entire human community, connected itself to one thing. Now that's both spooky and exciting. It's both an opportunity and a terror, right? Because when people work together, they can do amazing things, and they can also destroy things much more efficiently, right? People by themselves tend to not, exercise atrocities that they do in groups. But that's a fundamental reality. Whether you like it or not, that's what's happening, and that's what is going to be a part of the economy going forward. And then finally, it's ever more informational. This is the beating heart. This is the point. If you understand what information is, you'll get this. You'll get the AI debate. You'll get the significance of information technology. So what is information? Well, it's several different things. There's a long, complicated discussion here that I'm just going to skip by. Very smart people have described information in particular ways. One, for instance, explained information in terms of surprise. All right, so if, for instance, I take a coin, it's a quarter, and I show you it's a heads and a tails, right? Beforehand, there's two possibilities. Neither has been actualized. I flip the coin, it's tails. I've collapsed two possibilities into one. I've resolved the surprise. You wonder, what's it going to be? It's tails. And I've given you one bit of information. And so then if I flip the coin 10 times and record the sequence, that increases. There's a measurable number of bits of information in that. This is a huge insight, because what it meant is that we can actually measure information. So even though information doesn't have volume or weight, you can't smell it or taste it or feel it, we can measure it. Right? And so you can measure what it takes, for instance, to get a communication across a channel or distinguish a signal from noise. So it's very important, obviously, in communications theory and technology, but it doesn't finally answer what information is. And the reason is because analyzing information in terms of surprise or in terms of entropy, which is another way in which it's described, it doesn't distinguish between random gibberish and meaningful text. So let's take this Shakespearean text, methinks it's like a weasel, which is in English language, right? You kind of understand what it means. If you know the story, you know the context. Now you can measure that in terms of bits. It has a fixed amount of information. You just figure out how many possible letters and the spaces, and you run the numbers. You can scramble that so it's just random letters and spaces. It has the same amount of information in the type of information theory that most computer scientists talk about. Now, you know perfectly well we're missing something here. If that's all information is, that analysis doesn't quite get it. So information, it's kind of long story short, is something more than mere complexity or surprise or improbability. So what is it? The guy, by the way, that devised those two analyses is a guy named Claude Shannon at Bell Labs in the 1950s. Well, if you've ever been to Victoria in British Columbia, especially in the summer, you know, especially if you've taken a ferry, say from Port Townsend or from Seattle or somewhere, and you go into the harbor, there's an outer harbor and there's an inner harbor that's really secluded, so secluded that the provincial seat of government is about 100 feet from the water. That's ocean right there. That's what it looks like at night. And if you pull in on a ferry and you're looking at the kind of grassy knoll on the side, you notice something unusual, and you can't see it here in the evening. Here's a daytime picture. You see the red and the green? I don't know if you can make that out. You'll do it now. It says, "Welcome to Victoria." All right? Now, when you see that, do you say, well, let's run the probabilities of Canada geese flying south and dropping red and yellow begonia seeds and it just happening to fall out in that pattern? Is that possible? Yeah, of course, yeah, it's logically possible, but that's absurd, right? Because there's a much, much better and more likely explanation, right? Which is that some people, some gardeners, knowing it was Victoria, spelled it out for us. It's a vastly superior explanation. So you don't spend any time doing the calculations. You detect the activity of intelligence immediately. What are you detecting there? Are you just detecting improbability or complexity? No, because if it were a random assortment of seeds by those geese, that would also be improbable. It'd be very hard to reconstruct. But it would completely lack meaning. Right? The information that we're interested in, in information technology, is the combination of something like improbability and complexity with something called specification, or what we'll just call a meaningful pattern. If you get that, you get what information technology is about. It's about creating meaningful patterns. And where does that type of information come from? As the information theorist Henry Quasler puts it, we habitually associate the production of new information with the activity of intelligent agents. And in fact, many of us would argue that the production of new information, large amounts of new information, is the exclusive jurisdiction of intelligent agents. And so information technology and the information revolution and the information economy then is uniquely suited for intelligent agents, not for machines. So that then sets up the question, okay, so then if that's what the economy is like, what do I do not to be replaced by robots? Well, we focus, as I mentioned at the beginning, on our comparative advantage. We focus on those things that make us uniquely human agents. To be an agent is at the very least, first of all, to have first-person subjective experience and to be able to act for purposes deliberately for an end, right? Intentionally for an end. That's at the minimum what it means to be an agent. And in particular, that means we have the capacity for virtue. Think of virtue as acting habitually over and over in a way to use the computer metaphor, to reprogram ourselves to be something more than we were before. So if you're a person that's perpetually late and you irritate everyone around you and you decide you're going to be punctual, you start setting your alarm on your watch and you always get up when it goes off, you never hit the snooze button, right? And you force yourself to do it over and over and over. That's a habit, it's outside of you. But you, by an free act of the will, have decided to do it. And by deliberate practice, you eventually become more than you were before. You develop the virtue of punctuality. So then the question is, what are the virtues that we need in the information economy? Well, we need the virtues that correspond to those 5 features of the economy. And I'm going to breeze over these, but this is what, if a high schooler asks me what he or she needs to do, these are the virtues. Courage, which is the virtue of acting in the context of likely failure. In a disruptive age, whatever you choose to do, you're likely to fail sometimes. And so you have to cultivate the virtue of courage in the willingness to act, even with the possibility of failure. But failure over and over is not the path to success, unfortunately. You can just keep failing, You need a second virtue, which is anti-fragility. Anti-fragility is the virtue or the ability to improve with perturbation and failure, like a biological organism, like this guy. If you lift weights and you do it properly and deliberately, you actually tear muscle fibers. You have an inflammatory response on your muscles. But then if you eat and you rest, your body doesn't just adapt, doesn't just bounce back. It becomes stronger than it was before. That's also a virtue. When you fail, is it just something that happened, or is it something you learn from and it becomes more, helps you to become more than you were before? Altruism. Altruism has always been important. And here I'm talking about commercial altruism. Who do you think of when you hear the word altruism? Everybody thinks of the same person. You had to name one person that's altruistic. 20th century. Mother Teresa. Everybody, right? And it's because she was self-sacrificial. But there's also altruism in a commercial sense. And the commercial altruism is this act in which you do something that provides something for someone else in a way that also benefits you. So it's not this kind of supreme altruism of self-sacrifice in which you act for the benefit of the other at your own expense, right? Nevertheless, you anticipate the needs and the wants of others, and you orient yourself to provide something for them that they'll freely buy. So if you're a barista, right, or a butcher, you're hoping to get paid, right? And maybe you're kind of grumpy that day, but you orient yourself to be friendly and to do a job really, really well. That's a type of altruism. People think of this kind of market exchange as if it's about greed. No, it's not. If he's literally thinking about money all the time, he's going to be a terrible barista. A great entrepreneur that thinks just about money, that's not a way to invent a great new technology. Right? Great entrepreneurs, they think ahead. They anticipate something somebody might want or need before it exists. They muster money together. They put it at risk in pursuit of a dream that might make them wealthy, right? But that's an other-directed activity. That's always been important in business and in the economy. It's especially important in a digital age because there are now so many different kinds of things that people can create, digital goods. In an agrarian economy where everybody was a subsistence farmer, you're basically hoping to make enough to keep yourself from starving to death, right? You're more or less self-regarding. But now we don't have to be that way. Actually, probably nobody's going to starve to death, right? But they might not do well unless you create things that people want. So you can spend all day playing World of Warcraft, or blogging about the aliens in charge of the UN, if you want, right? But if nobody's going to pay you to do that, right, then if you're not being altruistic, it's not going to create value. But my argument would be that actually in a digital age with these digital goods that can be created in digital services, there are far more opportunities for people that are other-oriented. They figure out, what are the things that I could produce that would actually allow me to make a living and pay my rent and get my daughter's braces paid for? Collaboration, this one's obvious, right? In a hyper-connected age, the ways to work with other people are many and varied and often fraught with danger, right? So we still haven't gotten video conferencing quite off the ground. Though I can tell you, if you hobble yourself, you get pretty good at it really fast when you can't leave your house. But collaboration is a form of humility. Collaboration is essentially the willingness to learn from and work with others. There's a tech entrepreneur that says he tries always to remind himself that most of the smartest people in the world work for his competition and don't work for him, right? That collaboration is that attitude that you're not necessarily the smartest guy or gal in the room, right? There's stuff you can learn from other people, and you can do a lot more with people than you could do alone. And there are now unbelievable ways to collaborate. One of the things I do is I run an online news and commentary site for Christians. It's basically Catholics and evangelicals called The Stream. So I run it in my pajamas and for a while without pants on in my house in Washington, D.C. I have 6 staff in Euless, Texas by the DFW airport. We have editors all around the country in every time zone and about 60 contributors all around the world. And I don't even have to necessarily talk to them. I know who's on. I can look at the content management system. I can talk to them and approve stuff that's impending. We all work in real time together, and it's all because of technology that allows us to work together. It's a remarkable thing. And so it allows us to do things that we could not have done before. And we tend to think of the bad side of that and not think of the opportunities that it produces. And the final one is creative freedom. Now, when you hear freedom or liberty, right, let's say you haven't taken a philosophy class. Whenever I ask teenagers, what does it mean to be free? They universally, I don't know if this is genetically coded or something, give the same answer. Well, you're free if you can do whatever you want to do. All right, so if I can eat whatever ice cream I want and I can go to bed whenever I want, then I'm free. And if somebody is telling me what I have to do, I'm not free. Right? Now that's a sense of freedom. That's a minimal kind of freedom that philosophers call libertarian freedom. It doesn't have to do with libertarianism, it's just the term. Libertarian freedom is if you have the ability to choose freely between competing alternatives. Like you could say, well, I want to eat strawberry ice cream or chocolate, right? It's one or the other. Nobody makes you do either, and so you choose chocolate or whatever. You're free. All right, now so I think of that as a minimal condition for being free. Now think of a little girl whose parents buy her a nice piano. They tell her, you're free to play the piano. You can go in the room anytime you want, day or night. You can sit down and you can play the piano. So she sits down. She's never had a piano lesson, and she plucks out some notes, on the keyboard. Now, she's free in a sense. Her parents aren't going to stop her from doing it or make her not do it or make her do it. But is she free to play Rachmaninoff? Is she free to play that 4th movement of Moonlight Sonata that no one plays because it's super hard, right? Or Debussy? Or Beethoven? No. She's not free in that way. She's constrained. How would she become free to do that? She could only have that type of freedom by constraining herself, by constraining the possibilities, by limiting the things that she does with her time in a deliberate and focused way in which she puts her butt down on that seat, on that bench every day, and she practices boring scales and hard sequences over and over and over until she has them down in her muscle memory and her bones, and she becomes more than she was at the beginning. That is creative freedom. Notice what it involves. Yes, it involves surprise. It involves limiting the range of possibilities to an actuality, but it also involves self-improvement and self-constraint for a purpose, for a meaningful purpose. That's, I would argue, the sort of ultimate virtue that all of us will need if we want to differentiate ourselves from the work of machines, so that that little girl eventually plays those songs 10 or 12 years later. So what is it about these robots and these machines that terrifies us? Well, Bob Marks talked about the kind of psychological and literary foundations of that. But I would argue that a lot of this has to do with your prior assumptions. If you think human beings are more than machines, you're going to think one thing. If you think we're the result of a blind and purposeless process that gave rise to us, you might as well think, well, and we became conscious and built things. Maybe we're just an inflection point, and we're the last stage of biological evolution before technological evolution takes over. If we're just machines, then why can't our machines eventually replace us? But if we're not, if we're more than machines, then the way we should think of this is with awe and appreciation. Human beings are not mere Homo sapiens, not mere man the wise, but we're Homo faber. We're men and women who are makers and who are creators, who are made in the image of the ever-creative God. Thank you very much.